Hello, everyone. Coming at you live from hell itself in all of its fiery depths. Would everybody like to introduce themselves? With myself, of course, first, being Rupert.
I am a very melty Henry.
Dwelling in the Ninth Circle, Simon Burns.
And I'm Kurtz, feeling rather comfortable actually.
Well, good for you. Alright, today we are talking about the riots, the toppling of various statues, and maybe even a little bit about the autonomous zone, just to spice things up a little bit. It's quite a lot to cover, but hopefully we can at least have a little look at everything. I'm sure at this point everybody is at least somewhat aware of what's been going on, but for those relatively uneducated, what is it now, like as of 2 months ago, is it something like that? A fellow by the name of George Floyd was, and yes, I say that with an inflection that implies that I don't remember his name, because I think it was George Floyd. But anyway.
It was George Floyd.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. He was, he died as a result of a altercation with the police. I'm going to leave that statement fairly open because that has yet to be determined by court as to what actually happened to him. But he was having his neck knelt on at the time. And so obviously it looks pretty bad, being that it's showed up in video and on camera and such.
It's it's surprisingly complicated an issue, believe it or not.
Yeah. But we're not going to get into the specifics of that, because on the basis of that, there have been a number of protests which quickly devolved into riots, which have been, I suppose you could say, shilled for by almost every major corporation, many politicians, and quite a large section of the media. So we'll be talking about the consequences of that, because as part of all of these protests and riots and such, they've been tearing down statues all over the place. Even censoring some other bits of media as well, like in particular a episode of Fawlty Towers, oddly enough. And Songs of the South, I think. That's gone down fairly recently as well. Okay, so let's just start on the statues then, because that's probably the part where people have the most feelings to start off with. How do we all feel about that?
You shouldn't remove statues. And if you do it by vote. End of podcast.
I've been Kurtz.
Yeah.
In all seriousness, it's very frustrating to see, because ultimately, as Henry just said, you shouldn't really tear down these statues. You shouldn't at least tear them down, and if you really want them that badly removed, then it should be done by a vote by specifically by the people of the local area. People outside of the local area, frankly, have no business dictating whether or not a statue should remain, and the people who are tearing it down are a very clear, fringe minority that should not be doing this, because they're not speaking for everybody.
Yeah, I think the thing... So the reason I bring it up is because, especially in the case of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol, there have been numerous petitions for people saying, let's bring it down and bring it into a museum, which is what people are suggesting should have happened. But the petitions failed because not enough people wanted it taken down. It was a fairly small minority of people, or at least not a majority, that actually wanted the statue gone. Most people were in favour of leaving it there and at most putting a plaque on it saying, hey, slavery is bad, but we're leaving the statue.
Yeah, so I was actually looking into that issue a little while ago, and the petition that you were referencing, I think up until very, very recently got maybe a few hundred signatures, despite being set up years ago. And in terms of the process, like the actual administrative process of getting it taken down via the normal legal channels, they were still kind of trying to agree on what to actually put on the plaque when it was, unilaterally torn down. But that's not the only part of the, his memory that they were trying to erase. But I'll go into that in a second. Kurtz, were you wanting to say something?
I was just about to bring up what I think you're trying to go into, and I guess I'll make the point for you, unless, of course, you were going to say something else. And that's that Edward Colston did indeed trade in slaves, but that's not all he did, and that's not, as far as I'm aware, that's not what the statue went up for. Very few people get statues built because they were slavers. I'm sure there's somewhere in the world, someone who's like, hey, here's a slaver, here's a statue. Edward Colston was a titan of industry in the time he lived. That's why he's got a statue. That's why half of every single street corner building and charity in Bristol is named after him. That's why he has a statue, not because he was a slave trader.
And not just that, it was also his great philanthropy for the city itself. So he built loads of schools and hospitals, and generally using a lot of his money for the betterment of the city.
Yeah, that's the main thing, really, as I understand it.
Yeah, what is actually particularly frustrating, and I know this is a slight side tangent, is how a lot of stuff about the man has now been very sneakily worded, is the best way I can put it. It seems very deceptive, where it's like, oh, he donated to a lot of causes that I believe the phrasing was literally a lot of causes and organizations that aligned with his values.
I mean, yeah, whenever I've seen it talked about in the news, it's always been, oh yes, the slaver Edward Colston. It's like, we're really not going to go with the philanthropist Edward Colston or the industrialist Edward Colston. We're going with the slaver. All right then.
Well, that's why they've put why they've now sneakily worded it as, he donated to causes that aligned with his own beliefs, because then they can kind of weasel him away from being a philanthropist, because it's like, well, if he's not a philanthropist, if he's just doing it for his own beliefs and values, which last I checked is what everybody does, but that's me, I suppose.
Yeah,
it
so
does make it sound. Go on.
Well, I mean, to all of the sort of streets and buildings that were named after him, that's actually what I was going to go into, which is that before going for the statue itself, they were trying to basically get everything that was named after him renamed, and almost all of them just did so immediately, basically upon being pressed in any capacity, which is, I mean, it's quite interesting to look at the sheer amount of institutional power behind that, that mindset, I guess, and that wing of thought, because that is a very clear incident of them just pushing on an open door. Literally, all they had to do was say, "Hey, this guy's a slaver. You're against that, aren't you? Change the name of the building that's had that name for 300 or so years, or whatever, or however long it's been." And that was enough, despite the fact that in some cases, it was his money, his contributions that actually erected the building. And then, some other person comes along and ends up fulfilling that position of authority just through weaseling their way through the institution, and that's it. He has his legacy erased, basically.
I vote we change the Washington Monument to the Clinton Monument. It would be more suitable.
Ah, no, get out of here with that. Anyway, to look at this from the other perspective, though, the argument that I've heard, probably the strongest argument that I've heard on this matter, is it would be as though somebody stole a whole bunch of money and then used some of it to, give back to people in a charitable manner. What do we make of that argument, and can we sort of find a way around it?
Someone say Robin Hood. And basically, the entire story of that, obviously, that we need to go into it. But I don't know. I think, forgetting the specific case of Edward Colston for now, I don't want to retract from, or don't want to veer off from your point too far. So maybe I'll save it for later.
Okay. Well, the thing that comes to mind for me would be the response that was preemptively given by Lindy Beige in a video of all people, actually, which is quite interesting, because he drew the comparison of, this is some years ago, I should say, that when people were talking about removing the statue of Horatio Nelson, basically because, well, for similar reasons, basically they didn't think that he deserved a statue because he was at some point involved in the slave trade. I don't even remember how, it was quite remote, but there it is. Even at the time, so this is his point, even at the time, it was acknowledged that he wasn't a perfect man, because at the time, obviously, sexual promiscuity and sexual malfeasance was considered much more of a high-profile issue, I suppose. And so the fact that he was having an affair relatively openly and knowing that she was already married to someone of reasonable status, I believe, actually, as well. And he carried it on anyway, even though everyone knew. He knew that she was married. Everyone knew that he knew that she was married. But the fact that he had done what he had done to, qualify as being a hero worthy of a statue, and the great statue that he got, the column, Nelson's column, that was considered okay because you want people to do more good things. You want people to do heroic things, and you make the deal that we'll overlook some of your, worst qualities if you can do something that is sufficiently, noble and honor-worthy that, we'll give you this statue, this monument.
Yeah, I think it depends very much on what the statue is really for. So, as Kurtz said, you're not getting a statue for being a horrendous sexual deviant or for owning slaves. That you don't get statues for those. You'd get statues for performing great deeds in service of your country or in service of your community. And I think it's important to separate the fact because I think basically no one, or if you really want to go into details, you'd be very hard pressed to find many people that have both done really great deeds that we want to celebrate in the community and also don't have anything that they've done wrong in their past.
Right, this is the thing. Even the people who are typically considered to be almost perfect by modern standards were definitively not if you look into details. Like Martin Luther King Jr. cheated on his so he plagiarized a dissertation to get his master's degree, or was it his doctorate maybe? Either way, he completely copied the thesis of someone else, as I recall. He was also a wife beater, I believe, or an adulterer, one of the two. Gandhi was a terrible father and a racist, by modern standards. What do you do with that if you're demanding perfection?
Oh, that's kind of. I was feeling like this is fast going into territory of Voltaire right now, isn't it? With the whole idea of you've got what is effectively a group of people allowing this really, I'm just going to outright say it, misguided idea that everything must be perfect to become the enemy of good. It's like, oh, we can't focus on the good in anything because for every 5 good deeds this person may have done, there is this one bad deed, and we cannot reconcile that for some reason, even though you don't have to reconcile it. You really don't.
Especially if at the time it was acceptable. Like Edward Colston trading slaves, at the time perfectly acceptable to trade slaves. Even if you were against it, you would perhaps still engage in it because you needed to in order to be financially viable at the time. I think it was one of the American founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, I believe, who made it a mission of his to free slaves, but also did own slaves simply because he couldn't really operate in society at the time with the status that he had and not own slaves.
So it's pretty. Sometimes I feel like what is the weird motivation behind this is these people have this idea that we must find something that is perfect, even though, just logically speaking, and just how humans over time develop and change, that's just not going to happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's also be clear about what Colston was actually doing, which is that he wasn't personally taking part in the slave trade, and he wasn't exclusively dealing in slavery as kind of like its own separate business venture. He was a major stakeholder, or shareholder rather, in the West African trading company, the Royal Charter of the African Company, I believe, something like that, that basically included slave trading as part of its portfolio of business activities, and he gained money from that company.
So it could be argued that what these people are trying to get him basically erased for is something how like you it's the same sort of like weird not accepting degrees of separation, where it's like if I for whatever reason I was a stakeholder in a arms manufacturing company, would I then be liable or considered like a murderer then, because I've got I've got a stake in a arms manufacturing company.
So this is the thing. This is where I was going to take it. Is that by that kind of standard, most of us that have a pension are at least in some way culpable or involved with what is effectively the slave trade, or at the very least child labor. Being that you've got various companies like Apple who are willing to turn a blind eye to mining for rare resources, rare minerals in Africa that are it's conducted via child labor, and or Nike using child labor to make some of their shoes. Who else? I've got a feeling I saw a big list of them. I've got a feeling Chanel was involved as well, using child labor in either Bangladesh or India or Pakistan, one of those. Basically this is a very widespread thing, and the fact that we are financially, as a society, almost all of us are financially involved in some way with these companies that carry out these activities, that makes us all culpable by this standard. To be fair to them, there have actually been pushes to, sanitize all of these kinds of portfolios, but the situation is still what it is.
You're saying that by like not accepting those degrees of separation, because again, I am not old enough to really have bothered to look at the idea of a pension, but assuming that pensions are also a bit like well, instead of using pensions, what about like everybody who uses universal credit or job seekers allowance, or the DOL as it gets called? If that comes from taxpayer money and these companies are paying tax, then if you're not using any level of degrees of separation, then anyone who has been given dole money is technically guilty of child labor.
Well, not necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily limit it to pensions and directly investing in stock. Just by, I think you mentioned Apple, just by buying their product, you're taking part in it as much as, going back to Edward Colston, a lot of the, at least if you go to the Wikipedia article, it says he was deputy governor for a year of the Royal African Company, and then they were still sort of saying, oh, and then later on he was trading in slave-produced goods back in England, such as sugar and cotton, things like that. Just sort of like, well, these are things that happen to be produced by slaves that are valuable commodities that he's trading.
Yeah. Okay, I didn't even know that. That makes it even worse. But I mean, I was going to go to that the other line that you were talking about as well, which is that if you go from the buying a product angle, then that puts you even closer to the slave labor, because in order to receive that product at that price, you have to take part in those activities. The pseudo slavery, modern pseudo slavery. Or, alternatively, another one that's even more uncomfortable to a lot of people is porn. Because Pornhub is very blasé about the rape and sex trafficking that happens to make its way onto its platform.
So remember, everybody, you're all awful people.
Yeah, if you're defending the porn industry, you're probably also defending the sex trafficking industry, which is often a form of sexual slavery.
I'm not talking in general. If you buy anything from anyone, or you get any kind of payout from the government, you are evil because that money came from evil things, or that product was made due to evil causes. You are all evil.
Right. So this is if we take this line of thinking, rather than the alternate line of thinking, which is that we are willing to accept some amount of a person's flaws if they, meet that standard threshold of nobility, which warrants that they get a statue or something like that, or they get something named after them. If they do good things with their money that are, beneficial to society and that we want to see more of, then the deal is that we give you a statue, we name things after you, we, honour you, basically, going forward into the future. And to me, that's a pretty good deal. I don't think we need to go down this rabbit hole of how much of society do we need to dismantle to theoretically, possibly at some point, sanitize things to such a degree that morally we're okay with it, until the morality changes, of course.
I heard the argument in doing the research for this about, and it was specifically in relation to Edward Colston, and it was saying that if you allow that, and if you say, okay, well, we'll build your statue if you give a load of money away, it is in effect buying your way out of your sins. Which I see the argument there, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. It's like, if you're a slave trader and you're successful, you can just pay the money to your local community and all your sins are forgiven.
Sorry, go on.
Go on.
I was just going to say, what's the other alternative there? That somebody sells a whole load of slaves and then instead of putting that money into the community and actually helping people with it, they sit on it and use it to generate more money because there's no point in doing anything else with it. You're relying entirely on altruism if you do it that way, and you're relying on people wanting of their own moral volition to not take part in it, which sure, okay, and or then want to spend some of that money that they've earned on the kind of good causes that we want to see furthered, rather than saying, if you do this good thing, we'll reward you for it, even though we don't think that everything that you've done with your life is perfect.
I imagine they would be less, what's the word, snooty about it if he'd put his money into sort of freeing some of the slaves and trying to reverse some of the damage he did. But yeah, I don't think they'd be happy either way, to be honest.
I mean, it sounds like a very the chain of thinking that this sort of implies then is just really gives me this like corrosive vibe to the whole thing, where basically by having all of this kind of statue erasure, and then also like, oh well, you're just doing things that are altruistic because you think it will make the wrong you did better. It will somehow balance things out. That seems like really corrosive, just because then it's like, well, why bother being altruistic ever then, if you're just going to be greeted with that kind of mindset?
I mean, to your point, Henry, there is actually another example that we could point to where, well, I'll just talk about it rather than explain. So, Cecil Rhodes, famous imperialist and heavily associated with South Africa, left behind a lot of money a lot of money is an understatement, and created things like the Rhodes Scholarship, so that other people could basically rise on the same kind of drawbridge that he himself benefited from. And a lot of that has gone to uplifting, black students and whatever. And yet, even sometimes the same people who have benefited from that scholarship are people who want to tear down his statues because they don't agree with what he did. I don't think it necessarily matters. To me, it is kind of blatantly more about iconoclasm and trying to remove the symbols than it is about any perceived moral impurity. I think that's just the argument to make it acceptable in the public eye. Any thoughts?
I mean, I pretty much agree with that at this point, because, just today I saw the news that they, good grief, I've completely forgotten where it was, but they basically tore down I don't know if they tore it down necessarily, but I know that they vandalized a statue in the US that was of a Union colonel, not a Confederate, so someone who was technically on what is considered historically the good guy side in the mainstream viewpoint of that, and then also they happened to beat up a Democratic senator who happened to try and take their photos while they were doing it. But I think that's just part of the course at this point. But the destruction of that particular monument, along with things like obviously Thomas Jefferson, kind of prove that it's not so much. maybe not so much Thomas Jefferson, but it basically kind of proves the whole idea that it is just about removing icons rather than about anything to do with morality.
Yeah, I was just hoping to build on what you were just saying there, Simon, in that this is to change the topic slightly, certainly away from Edward Colston and more onto the protesters themselves. They are just attacking any and anything that they can get their hands on. A statue of Robert the Bruce, the Scottish king, in Scotland was vandalised, despite the fact that that man probably never even met a black person. He probably didn't even know black people existed. That was just the time that he had lived in. It was still vandalised by Black Lives Matter. There was a memorial in the US to a American Civil War regiment, and it was an entirely black regiment that fought for the North. So, again, complete like misfire there on the protesters' half. They are doing this without thought. They are just trying to destroy anything that they can get their hands on. They see a statue of a man who looks white and is wearing old-timey clothes, and have just made the assumption that he must be racist and therefore must be a valid target. It's become absurd.
And just to give people some information there, the monument that Kurtz was referring to is the 49th Massachusetts Regiment.
Yeah, there was a similar incident in Martinique, I believe, actually, where they tore down the statue of a man whose sole contribution effectively was to abolish slavery on Martinique. So, yeah, really, you just can't. There is no winning the situation. It is just pure, raw iconoclasm, destruction of history, basically, in as much as possible. I suppose. Why do we think this is happening then? Why do we think there is such an interest in destroying the history like this? To me, I get a lot of very strong ISIS vibes. I'll be honest, and that's not an uncommon point to make around these circles. But yeah, it is what it is.
So, I don't know if I'd say it was even that complicated. I feel like it's just they have seen some statues of some racists being taken down. Therefore, pretty much any statue is fair game. And mob justice, you get a bunch of people just happen to be around a statue. They're like, hey, let's take it down. I don't think it's... I don't know. I don't think we can give them that much credit to be doing their research. I must be honest.
While I mostly agree with that, it's also I am a very paranoid person by my nature, and so I can't help but see things in a way of like, yes, most of these people don't know the history because for some reason people have this whole idea that history is so boring when it's actually one of the most interesting topics you could ever read and listen about and everything. Like there's so much history in the world that you could not possibly cram it all in your head. But I feel like these people are kind of I'm just going to call them what they are, useful idiots for someone else's motivations, and I think it's someone in the background is wanting to destroy these icons for some possibly ideological purpose.
It's really hard not to come to that conclusion based on all of the support that they've had. I mean, it seems like in the current environment, you can basically lose your job just for not supporting them, never mind taking a neutral stance. That's not allowed. You need to be full-throated in favour and often be pressured into giving money to some of these causes as well, to sometimes fairly dubious places or dubious causes, I guess. But then, what's the end game on all of this then? I mean, this gets onto the larger sort of riot and protest sort of movement. So where does all of this go? A lot of people have been describing it as a cultural revolution, and it's kind of hard not to see it that way, but what do you think?
I mean, where all this tearing down of statues and things goes, it is an erasure of history. You can see it in... I hate pointing out fictional examples, and especially the one that I'm going to bring up because it's so overused, but it's so goddamn relevant. It's 1984. A huge plot point of that is that when the main character Winston walks through London, every street name has been renamed, every building's been renamed, every statue has been torn down, and that there is nothing that anyone can use to connect themselves to the past. And you could drew the comparison earlier, Rupert, of this is exactly what ISIS does when they overtake an area. They smash any statue and burn any book that disagrees with their ideology. And again, it's the same thing that the Nazis did with their book burning. It is the destruction of information, and particularly the destruction of history, and that leads to ignorance amongst the population. And an ignorant population could be easily controlled or manipulated by someone. I don't know who's trying to benefit off of this, but
To be specific about ISIS, what people think it's they destroy things that are against the Muslim faith, and it's like, no, they destroy everything because it's in their best. To them, it's in their best interest to erase the entire history of an area, because then it makes that area more culturally malleable, and it means that they can shape it to be more accepting of Islam, and that's kind of the end goal for them in particular.
Yeah. Although it is interesting to note that in the case of Palmyra, as I understand it, they were paid specifically to destroy a lot of those monuments and all of the artifacts that they found in the museums and such, which is an interesting wrinkle. I'm not entirely sure who paid them, but supposedly they were getting paid for it. Who would be the paymaster in this regard, then? Because there's certainly a lot of money behind it.
I mean, I'm not sure if you... It's always hard to tell, because I am not one of these people, so you're never going to see me... I cannot even begin to fathom what goes through some people's heads, but I feel like, obviously, someone is trying to... It's either someone who is very much an ideological zealot, very much firm-heartedly believes in an ideology, and considering how the kind of leaning of the groups they're quote-unquote manipulating, I feel like we have someone who is maybe very much in the communist Marxist category, or for all I know, it's some sort of like weird power play, but you just never know with that sort of thing.
Yeah, so Spandrel's talked about an idea called bio-Leninism, and I think I've talked about it sort of off the podcast to you guys before, but effectively it's the idea that if you take some people who have effectively nothing without you, so being that you are somebody who already has some amount of power, you take these people who are completely powerless, give them a bit of power, and they'll be entirely beholden to you because they have nothing going for them otherwise. And so you use them as your foot soldiers and vanguard in whatever you want to do to prop up your power. And they will stay loyal to you because they physically have no power otherwise. And the reason that it's, bio-Leninism in this case is because there is the biological element whereby these people are biologically nothing, no one in society, or biologically without power, effectively, either because they are, ugly, or they are deficient in some way. They have some kind of physical set apart, something that sets them apart physically. Maybe they're an ethnic minority or something that is going to be perpetually hated is too strong of a word, but they're not going to be in the mainstream of society. Therefore, it's easy to offer them power just for being who they are and just because they're an outsider, as long as you are completely loyal to this already powerful entity.
I believe that it's just the disregarded. It's people who don't really leave an impression on anyone is probably the best way to describe it. They're easy to ignore, and it's the problem that comes out of it is that, speaking as someone who does think of himself as a bit of an outsider, is that these kind of things don't really come out of a place of malice. It's just you're not particularly remarkable.
Yeah, although in some cases there may be more to it than that. So, just to drop out another reference, the Jolly Heretic, unfortunately his name eludes me at this moment, but he talks about spiteful mutants as well, effectively people who are within a population who have a number of sort of developed genetic traits which make them turn on their host group for whatever reason. He's probably gone into it more than I'm able to cover here, but effectively that there are a certain group of sort of almost biological outcasts who are devoted almost to trying to destroy stable society and normal society that would be able to, continue being healthy.
I believe you're referring to an Edward Dutton, is it?
Oh, yeah, Edward Dutton.
Dutton, okay. Sorry, I weirdly pronounced those kind of DU sounds, I suppose.
Yeah, that's him. So, to anyone listening, I would highly advise, if you haven't, to go and listen to some of his content, because it's quite good in itself, and he'd be able to explain some of this stuff better than I can. But he quite often brings across that profile of somebody who might fit into this category of low power biological outsider, someone who can't really have power except for within this framework where they are the client of someone who is much more powerful and using them to further their own power.
I suppose I don't know if I agree I agree with you totally, because I think most of the the money, I think probably a lot of the people as well seem to be this like middle class lefty type, which obviously not cultural outsiders completely sort of without power. But as to their motivations for it, maybe because maybe the argument there is that they're using their power and influencing the culture of the black community to further their own aim. But I don't know what they're getting out of it.
I mean, they kind of fit the description because they're not particularly useful or skilled as far as if you're going into like the kind of cogs of machines of how societies function and operate. And I mean, if we want to maybe veer onto it in a second, we can talk about the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone or the Capitol Hill Occupy protest, whatever they're referring to it now, because that kind of gives you an example of kind of how I'm going to be very nasty now and just say how kind of just generally useless these people are to society as a whole.
Yeah, I was just going to build on what Henry had just said, was this idea of these sort of white middle class people getting in on this kind of stupidity, and I think the most obvious explanation for it would be that it's virtue signaling, that they just want to show people how virtuous they are and how accepting they are and how they think that they're getting totally behind this whole Black Lives Matter thing, and they're outraged by all the police brutality and stuff, and their way of doing it is to make these public displays. I'm sure we've all seen those videos of white people happily bending down and kissing black people's shoes just because they're like, yeah, I'll do that. I'll show how like forward thinking I am.
Basically, LARPing is revolutionaries.
Not in that case. I think they're fully kind of brainwashed by that point. If they're just kissing some random black guy's shoe because they believe that they have original sin in the form of I don't know, some kind of white privilege or existing within a white supremacist society or whatever nonsense. Couple of things though. So in response to your point about the white middle class types who are supporting this, I guess the question I would raise, because when talking about this, there's an assumption that we're kind of starting at a point where these people are already in their low position and they're being raised, but that's not quite the case. That's an ongoing process, and so they may already have been raised by this system of powerful patrons who are giving them power and resources in exchange for support. And you see this with the kind of people who are finding themselves in some, enormous corporation, receiving massive wages to be a diversity consultant or something. That very comfortably puts somebody in the middle class, despite them having a pretty bullshit job that relies entirely on ideology and has very little, serious basis behind it other than the ideology of critical race theory and all that kind of thing. So we are in motion within this system, and so, like I said, there's that one category of people who have already been raised, but there's also the other category of people who's probably worth considering, who look at the kind of media sources that are promoted in the mainstream and are treated as being the center or center left of the Overton window, which is ever moving left, might I add, and they just trust that as being the truth. Therefore, they act on it as the truth, as a virtuous person in society. And so they're being dragged along by the people who are making decisions and pushing certain narratives in this media context, and are not really looking too heavily outside, or are very cautious of looking outside of that bubble, and don't see half of the video clips on Twitter and such that people like us are seeing of what's actually happening on the ground, and seeing some of these alternate opinions and how things might be different to how they've been sold.
Yeah, relying on giving people just a surface value view of everything rather than going fully in depth, or encouraging people to go fully in depth. Like, I feel like it was never really a thing, but I do remember when I was younger, there was a lot of encouragement to always dig a bit deeper into what you read, see, and hear, because you might not be getting the whole story. But then maybe I'm just being nostalgic for a better time or something.
Yeah, I think it's easy to fall into that kind of nostalgia, but I mean, so it's the difference between people who are acting maliciously from this position of already being raised up by a patron, and the ignorance of people who don't know any better. Some amount of people will probably also just be pushed into it because it's seen as the good and correct opinion, and don't really question it because they're not deep enough into this sort of thing and don't really care to be. So that's probably an element as well, but I mean, yeah, there's probably a lot more to talk about with this. I think that's probably becoming a theme of these casual chats, is that we hit upon something that needs much deeper discussion than we're able to really give it, because there is this whole phenomenon, like you said, about kissing the boots of some random black guy who demands it because of this original sin sort of situation. And I use those terms deliberately because it does take on a very religious quality. I don't know if you guys have seen the shrine, effectively, that they've created around George Floyd's death, where he died.
No, I haven't, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure I'm looking forward to that casual chat, because it sounds like it could be very esoteric, because we've been going kind of deep into, frankly, what does sound like a conspiracy rabbit hole about who's pulling the strings, etc., if I'm being brutally honest.
Yeah, in some way it probably does, but it's kind of hard not to see history in that frame once you start looking for those kinds of the patrons. I guess this builds quite well on something that we were talking about quite a few casual chats ago now, but to say that the whole patron-client relationship that we saw develop in the Roman world, that kind of thing, never seems to have really gone away. Certainly by my viewing of history.
Right, so do we want to talk about the autonomous zone at all, or do we not?
Yes, we might as well cover it at least somewhat quickly. Seeing as you brought it up, have you been following it much?
Been following it in a very mimetic sense. Like, I'm very much trying to derive amusement and pleasure from it. The German word Schadenfreude comes to mind, because it is quite amusing.
Yeah, so for the uninitiated, this is probably one of the clearest examples of this kind of relationship, whereby, effectively, a group of Antifa types and protesters and rioters and all those, they took over a police precinct in Seattle? I think it's Seattle. And this is effectively because they didn't physically force them out. There wasn't an open street battle per se, but the police were told to evacuate by the mayor, and the mayor has been effectively preventing them from reasserting control over the area, which means that they've been given this area, effectively, the Antifa types, and they've been ruling it effectively however they please, which is poorly, as it turns out.
Yeah, I was going to say ruling is a strong word. It's a couple blocks in the Capitol Hill area of Seattle, like you said, where it's essentially just anarchy. They've got people running around with guns, with using their authority is derived essentially from the fact that they own a gun, and that's how they're quote unquote policing the area, and it just seems to have been absolute and utter chaos from what we've been able to see. It's not been very safe for journalists to get in there, because it's not exactly safe for anyone to get in there.
It's a bit of a mixed bag where it's one of these things where initially, I don't know if it was maybe just the novelty or just the shock or whatever, but initially things weren't necessarily terrible. But then the problem is that things kind of deteriorated rather rapidly, especially when it was realized that despite trying to call themselves an autonomous zone, they don't really have the ability to make themselves autonomous, because, like, I mean, there were so many memes and jabs at their garden, which it's one of these things where I feel like what's the best way to describe it? It's like I feel like there are like 5-year-olds out in the world who understand gardening better than these people do.
Yes, so to clarify, they are trying to grow their own food to be self-sufficient in one of the parks, and it's quite rooky. If you were to look up some of the images, it's effectively some sheets with a bit of topsoil on top and some depotted plants that have been put to, let's optimistically call it, grow in the topsoil.
Yeah, it's not great.
Yeah, I believe I heard it. I think I read this on Twitter somewhere, but it's been described as that they are speedrunning communism because they ran out of food in about 3 days on account of the fact that they were giving it away for free. A bunch of homeless people moved in, took as much as they could carry, and then left. So yeah, that's already happened. Oh, and also, I believe they've changed the name of it to CHOP, as in the occupied zone, because there was something to do with if it was occupied. No, sorry. If it was autonomous, then there's some different legal ramifications to that. I don't understand the specifics of it.
To expand on what you're saying there, Kurtz, it's what they've done is before it was the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, which they realised was maybe a bad name because it implies an insurrection, even though they basically announced as soon as they were making it was an insurrection, so they can't really evade the law in that case, because you can't just be like, oh, it was an insurrection when you announced it was an insurrection from the beginning. The CHOP refers to Capitol Hill Occupied Protest. They're trying to make it sound as if it's like Occupy Wall Street, basically.
Ah, yes, that old thing. Just won't die.
Yeah, and now we're talking about the very funny things here, but now I will actually stop being a bit of a memey boy over here and actually tell you about some of the rather horrible things that people won't talk about or that you will not find. And you'll have to take everything I say with a grain of salt because there's a lot of hearsay and not a lot of solid data, but there are rumours that the rape statistic has doubled in the area. So if you're a lady in that area, I suggest you be incredibly careful. The other thing as well is there is a man who I believe is called Raz, and he is not liked by anyone, but he is basically someone who is in the area with a lot of guns, and while it's a bit hyperbolic to call him a warlord, that is what people now call him, because he is basically ruling by force. And there were reports, and again, grain of salt, I don't know if this is true, there are reports that he has been trying to make, of all things, a harem of fine ladies for himself. And then there's the fact that his absolutely cringy name, I think they literally call them social police or something like that, who go around and get what is effectively protection money off businesses, off the local businesses that are within the zone. And so you can list extortion in in the list of things going on there, along with a lot of sexual assault, and also Raz has been apparently giving out firearms to other people, which I think even before massive new gun legislation came in to restrict the Americans' firearms, it was incredibly illegal to remotely give anyone else a firearm. Firearms have to be registered to the individual. You cannot just grab a gun, buy five hunting rifles and give 4 out to your mates.
I'm still waiting to find out how this is somehow Trump's fault, I must be honest.
I mean, speaking as someone who's very neutral on the matter of Trump these days, I feel like it is kind of Trump's fault because he could force the issue, but he doesn't.
I would like to say, he's doing nothing about it, but that's the problem. He could easily do something. I mean, it would be extreme, but you could say, well, if you're your own country and you're making an insurrection and you're taking American land, then in that case we'll send in the armed forces to take it back. That's an extreme example, but I mean that would make them shit themselves, wouldn't it? Put an M1 Abrams and a couple soldiers on the border and tell them that you're going to start marching in by dawn.
I feel like I feel like that would only hurt him in the short term and the long term.
It would be a good show. I admit it's a extreme example. You could probably achieve the same effect by just forcing the police to go back in there, but it would be a show of strength at the very least. And What he's doing now is just weakness to just allow them to do it.
Yeah, I mean, at risk of going on a tangent, I feel like it's showing how incompetent they are, whilst also avoiding looking like he's being a tyrant. Because I think the city governor or the state governor is not wanting him to move in with the National Guard. He's wanting to deal with it himself, at least from what I heard. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I think that would be a bit unconstitutional of him to just come in from a top-down presidential level and go against the word of the local authorities.
Both the city governor and the state governor, I dare say, because I'm pretty sure they're both democratic and very deeply anti-Trump. But I mean, yeah, you're getting into what I was going to say about it, which is that it gets into constitutionally murky territory, and it might be considered to be a going beyond his powers kind of situation, or at least perceived to be to enough of an extent that he could get significant institutional resistance. And the institutional resistance is, again, it just goes back to how this even exists in the first place. The reason why it's there is because they have people like the mayor as supporters, and so many people within the institutions that this is effectively a proxy state of sorts that is controlled by certain democratic, powerful people, such as the mayor. That's the only reason this place exists, because the police could go in any time and shut it down. These are not like armed revolutionaries with tanks and AKs and such. I mean, they have some guns, but we're not talking like enough that they would be able to resist the forces set against them. Not by a long shot.
To that end, by the sounds of it, the majority of their complement is AR-15s. It's hunting rifles, and along those lines, very, very low power commercial firearms are sold all over the place in the United States.
Well, no, let's be fair. They could kill quite a few people if there was to be a show of force, and if they wanted to defend themselves properly. But that's not even how they came into this situation in the first place. It was a capitulation by these central entities, and so they would pose the same problem to Trump trying to reinsert order, because they do support the autonomous zone. That is the situation, and so they will do everything in their power to protect it from people like Trump, even though Trump does represent the will of the American people in this sense, even the will of the people who are local to that area. It's just because these groups, these Antifa types and rioters and whoever it is that's making up this contingent in the autonomous zone, they are being supported by these people like the mayor and presumably also the police chief.
Yes and no on the police front, because from what I've been reading, and again, there's so much murky information. It's so hard to get solid information about this event. But there seems to be a very big implication that the police are not happy with the orders the mayor is giving them. I don't know if that in particular means I doubt it's going to turn into a full-on loss of control of the police or anything, and the police will take things into their own hands. But it might get to a point where, if things get too out of hand for the mayor to handle, or to a point where the mayor does not want to support this, she might not have a police force left to do anything with.
I mean, let's be clear that what she is ordering them to do, effectively, I believe it's she. That what they're being ordered to do is definitively unconstitutional. You can't just refuse to enforce the law in a certain area just because you politically support them. That is like 101 law and sovereignty statehood. You have to have the law applying everywhere. And just because they are choosing not to, actually enforce the law there, suggests that they care more about, being affiliated and acting within the rules of the political framework that already exists over actually enforcing the law. Yeah, because what she's telling them to do is going against the law, and they chose her.
Yeah, and sorry, not meaning to throw anyone off track, but the mayor of Seattle is Jenny Durkan.
Yes, that's it.
And so it doesn't look. It looks like the only way the autonomous zone will end is when, funny enough, the people within it will choose to end, and I don't know when that'll be, because I don't really ever peering into this mindset, though I do find it a little bit disturbing that they want to keep this going despite the fact that they've had apparently 3 shootings in that area that have resulted. That I think one of them has definitely resulted in someone's death. The fact that there's general extortion, the fact that the laws that Raz's group have enforced is incredibly extreme, such as apparently someone was graffitiing, tagging like another gang's turf or something, and Raz's men found him and then like literally pointed a gun to his head over him basically graffitiing a wall, which is a bit extreme if you ask me.
Yeah, I should say that as far as I know, they've the mayor has been gradually withdrawing her support and telling them to pack it in effectively, so we might see it being cracked down on in the near future. As far as I know, it still exists as of this moment, but I've got a feeling it's winding down, so we're kind of already talking about it in a post hoc kind of sense. But in that sense, we can get even more of a clear picture of the Seattle police and where their affiliations lie.
I feel like a lot of police are more loyal to... I mean, I'm not sure if this is a US problem or just a general police problem across the world, but I do notice that a lot of police officers tend to be loyal to each other, loyal to their chief, and by extension loyal to their mayor, so rather than the people themselves.
Yeah, they're not working in a capacity where they are, nobly upholding some higher principle. I don't think the police almost anywhere really hold to that kind of standard, but it is interesting that when they are asked to effectively go against the law and just refuse to enforce it in a certain area, even if it means that people are going to die, like they have, and crimes are going to happen and they're going to be unpunished, then yes, they will stay loyal. That's got to be an important data point going forward.
I mean, I just hope the autonomous zone ends soon, because as soon as I saw that like doubling and higher of sexual assault cases in the area, I was like, okay, that is really not a good sign.
Well, we have no way of knowing. It's not being recorded properly, obviously. It's I have to imagine that's just based on heuristics about what people have self-reported, so who knows. But I would not at all be surprised, based on the circumstances, and based on the fact that there are no punishments right now.
Yeah, it's basically a dark zone when it comes to data at this point, because it is just so hard for anyone to get a reading of what's going on in there. They're so defensive when journalists try and get in, and people who live in the surrounding areas are afraid to speak out about it. I remember seeing an interview with a person who lives just a few blocks away from the autonomous zone, and he had his face blurred and his voice modulated from fear of what would happen. I would actually just like to say to any of our viewers, go and look at and try and find as much as you can about the autonomous zone, because it is some very interesting and entertaining stuff.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if it's going to get scrubbed in the near future. If it's going to get memory hold, as so many things seem to nowadays.
I wouldn't be surprised, which would be a shame, because as much as, like I said earlier, I've been getting a sense of schadenfreude out of it, I have been more focusing on the things that are like, that's funny, like the thing I didn't mention about their gardens as well is they're segregated gardens. There's a garden for black people specifically and a garden for white people specifically.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that as well. They've been doing the same with just other kinds of spaces as well. Black spaces and white spaces.
Yeah, and so that's why I feel like it was very important to mention all the negative stuff, because I feel like I was maybe not giving the bad parts its due, where it's like, yes, this is funny on the surface, but the more you go digging into it, the more it's just very like, I feel like it'd be a shame if it was to get memory hold, because I know that there probably are quite a few innocent people in the wake of this who have been harmed and who frankly probably didn't deserve it.
Yeah, well, I mean, such always happens. And remember, Europe's downstream of America, so expect this to come to a neighborhood near you anytime now. Or, well, anytime in the next couple of years. So I guess it's best to learn as much as you can from the situation and prepare accordingly where possible. And that seems like a pretty good place to call it. If any of you have any final statements that you'd like to make?
Just one. That is fucking depressing, Rupert.
Yep.
They won't have guns at the very least.
Hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to finish this off then, Henry?
Yeah, Yeah, I was just going to expand on your point there. I think, well, I suppose, yeah. I think Europe is obviously being affected by these black wolf mass predators, and I think it is interesting how much we've seen, despite the fact that we have, at least a lot fewer cases of police brutality.
To put it mildly.
Yeah. And yet, the same level of violence and the same level of insanity. So yeah, get your potato crops going, lads.
Yeah, learn how to farm. Apparently it's going to be very important.
Learn how to farm, learn how to forage, learn basic survival skills. No, seriously, we might have to become Step Hill Gang here.
Oh yeah, Step Tribe Gang. It's the future.
Well, goodbye, everyone.
Yep, we'll leave it there. Bye, everyone.